It began with whispers in the Siberian logging towns, fleeting rumors spoken in the half-light of taverns where men drank to forget the silence of the taiga. Sometime in the winter of 1962, near a forgotten gulag settlement east of Bratsk, an orchard appeared where no orchard had ever stood before. Not one or two trees, but an entire forest of black-barked trunks with crowns of obsidian leaves glistening as if they had been forged in glass furnaces. The orchard seemed to grow overnight, emerging from the frozen ground as though the permafrost had split and spat it out whole. By dawn, it had withered. Nothing remained but a ring of ash-blackened soil, as if fire had consumed it from within. But the villagers who ventured near swore they smelled not smoke, but wet stone and iron, the mineral tang of freshly broken earth. The Soviet authorities, already wary of strange tales filtering out of Siberia, sent a survey team under the banner of the NKVD. Officially, their task was to investigate a possible illegal fire clearing of forest lands. Unofficially, the orchard was logged into a restricted file under the cryptic designation Cherny Sad, the Black Garden. The team's report has never surfaced in full, but fragments exist in the archives of Novosibirsk State University, blurred carbon copies, hand-marked in red pencil. They describe trees that left no biological samples behind. No rings, no fibers, no sap. When cut, their cores crumbled into a fine powder like volcanic glass. Soil samples taken from the site showed traces of something resembling magnetite fused with quartz. Not naturally occurring, the marginalia notes. Thermal processes unknown. The file ends abruptly, with the last page torn away. Folklore spread faster than the state could contain it. Locals spoke of prisoners who had vanished from the old camp in the forest years earlier. Some claimed they had been marched into the taiga during the construction of a hydroelectric dam, never to return. An old Evenki herder told of shadow roots that drink not water but memory, feeding on the voices of men. At night, people said they heard a hum like power lines stretched across an empty valley, though no pylons stood for miles. When the orchard appeared, the hum grew louder until dawn silenced it. In Moscow, the orchard was framed differently. Internal memos between ministries classified it alongside meteorological anomalies. The Tunguska blast, unexplained lights over Murmansk, disappearing convoys in Yakutia. Some saw in it a weapon, others a sign of foreign interference. The Americans, after all, were launching satellites into orbit by then, and paranoia dictated that even trees might be an experiment. But there was something distinctly Soviet in the handling of it. Witnesses were interrogated, villages sanitized, and cartographers quietly erased the site from public maps. The orchard, they declared, was a phantom phenomenon, the result of atmospheric inversion combined with local hysteria. The case was closed, officially, and yet the orchard appeared again. Not once, but several times across different winters in places hundreds of kilometers apart. Each time it followed the same pattern, a sudden eruption of black foliage, a night of whispered hums, and by dawn, only barren earth. Files multiplied, thick with witness accounts, hunters stumbling upon glass leaves that shattered at their touch. Geologists baffled they passed it by dusk. When they returned at dawn, nothing remained. It was never acknowledged in Pravda or Izvestia, never spoken aloud by officials. But in closed rooms, men with heavy pens drew diagrams of the orchard's geometry, as though mapping not trees but antennas. The orchard was not understood as nature, but as architecture. Something had been built overnight in the wilderness, something that withered because it had completed its function. What that function was, no one could say. By the late 1970s, the orchard had become a ghost entry in the indexes of state secrecy, a case referred to only in oblique footnotes and code words. And yet every few years, another rumor surfaced. A hiker vanishing near Yakutsk, a logging crew returning mute, a photograph seized by border troops that alleged always the same refrain, spoken in fear and awe. The Obsidian orchard bloomed again. In the months that followed the first official sightings, the orchard began to take on the shape of a rumor that slipped through the cracks of Soviet control. What had once been contained in stamped folders and guarded reports leaked into the language of those who lived at the edges of maps. Hunters told of moving through the taiga at night and hearing something vast and brittle overhead, as though a canopy of glass was shifting with the wind. Gulag survivors whispered of comrades who had walked out during work detail and never come back, their tracks ending in a perfect circle burned into the snow. A group of railway workers spoke of finding tools magnetized overnight, screwdrivers clinging to each other like iron filings, as if the orchard had passed unseen. Their statement, buried in the archives of Krasnoyarsk, ends with one word written in trembling hand: sad. The state, of course, could not allow the orchard to become a myth. Myth was dangerous, destabilizing, unscientific. Yet in the Central Committee minutes from early 1963, a curious phrase appears: reports of the Black Groves have escalated in frequency and scope. Attached to this entry is a note from an officer of the Ministry of Internal Affairs. He writes that the orchard might be a side effect of deep seismic disturbances, though no explanation is given for why trees would emerge like sculptures and vanish as if consumed by their own shadows. Another memorandum suggests the orchard was a misinterpretation of atmospheric plasma, echoing the paranoia of an era where even light in the sky could be feared as foreign intervention. But the orchard did not behave like plasma, nor like any known trick of weather. It behaved like an intention. By late winter, a special detachment of geologists, botanists, and electrical engineers, operating under the cover of industrial accident prevention, was dispatched to Siberia. What they found was more absence than presence. Soil patterns showed concentric circles where heat had once radiated outward. Tree stumps that should not exist protruded from ground that, according to geological records, had not supported growth for centuries. Instruments recorded brief but violent spikes of magnetism, peaking only at night. And then there were the witnesses, two Evenki hunters, brothers, who described watching the orchard appear in silence. They claimed the trees rose not from the ground but from the air itself, unfolding upward like negatives developing in a chemical bath. One of them said he saw faces in the leaves, blurred, indistinct, as if caught in sheets of obsidian glass. When questioned, he refused to speak again. His brother later disappeared from the hospital where he had been taken for observation. Unofficial testimonies carried a darker edge. Prison camp guards recalled punishment walks into the forest that had ended in disarray, with men reappearing hours later unable to speak, their lips split as if by frostbite, though the weather was mild. A truck convoy carrying construction equipment to a hydroelectric site reportedly stopped dead in its tracks when an orchard bloomed across the road. The drivers insisted the air itself turned heavier, their lungs burning until the trees withered and they could pass. These reports never entered public record. They survive only in scattered references, files marked destroyed, letters intercepted by censors, a journal entry from a conscript scrawled in the margins of a notebook confiscated during a border inspection. Yet patterns began to emerge in secret, always in winter, always between dusk and dawn, always near abandoned settlements, derelict mines, or the skeletal remains of camps emptied by decree. Some in the Academy of Sciences speculated that the orchard fed on absence, the absence of people, the silence of forgotten places. Others proposed something stranger, that it was the materialization of memories buried in the soil, echoes of violence and labor crystallizing into a temporary architecture. No theory could be tested, because by the time instruments were deployed, the orchard was gone. Still, the reports spread, stubborn and impossible to stamp out. An engineer in Novosibirsk claimed he saw men in unmarked trucks collecting fragments of the soil where the orchard had stood. A woman in Irkutsk swore her husband was taken after sketching the trees from memory. In Omsk, a rumor ran through the military that the orchard was no accident but an experiment, an NKVD project gone wrong, its origins traced back to the secret laboratories in the Urals, where physics and paranoia blurred into the same pursuit. And yet, for every voice that tried to explain, there were others who demanded silence. Officials called it a fairy tale, a peasant story. They insisted that nothing in the taiga could grow overnight and vanish by dawn. But silence only made the orchard stronger, gave it weight in the imagination. It became a thing one could not dismiss once heard, a shape you began to see even in the patterns of bare branches against the winter sky. The orchard had not been eradicated, it had only been noted, contained, and placed into a drawer labeled non-existent. But those who lived nearby, who listened at night for the hum in the snow, understood what the state would not admit. The orchard was not gone. It was waiting. By the mid-1960s, the orchard had become a shadow subject in the corridors of Soviet secrecy, a phenomenon spoken of only in code among scientists and officers who knew better than to put too much on paper. Yet the paper trail still exists in fragments, and those fragments reveal a picture far more unsettling than any official denial. A declassified cable from Irkutsk mentions localized black growth recurring on 12 February, proximity to abandoned mine shaft, recommend immediate cordon. Another memo, unsigned and nearly unreadable through layers of censor's ink, refers to optical distortions within groves, personnel experiencing nausea, vertigo, auditory hallucinations. These were not the words of peasants or herders. These were trained observers, engineers, and soldiers whose language had been stripped of superstition, yet they described the same impossible orchard. In the local folklore, stories spread faster than documents could be locked away. Children in villages along the Angara were warned not to stray into the snow at night, lest they follow the black leaves and vanish forever. Old men recalled the war years, whispering that the orchard had first appeared when prisoners were marched eastward into the gulags. They claimed it grew on their bones, that the ground itself had remembered their hunger. Some insisted the orchard was not trees at all, but the shadows of trees from another world, bleeding into ours for a single night. When dawn came, the shadows withdrew, leaving only scorched earth behind. But it was the testimonies from within the state apparatus that carried the most dread. A geophysicist from Akademgorodok, under interrogation in 1967 for ideological sabotage, recounted being sent to one of the sites. He wrote of instruments malfunctioning as they approached the perimeter, compasses spinning, Geiger counters surging into red without cause. He described the orchard as emitting no light, yet the snow around it glowed faintly, as though it reflected something not visible to the human eye. His final note before his dismissal reads, "It is not organic. It is not geological. It is something constructed." The phrase was underlined twice by his interrogators. That same year, a group of Komsomol volunteers working on a forestry project near Tomsk vanished. Their tents were found intact, meals half prepared, but the footprints leading away ended abruptly in a ring, burned into the frozen ground. The case was quietly compared to the Dyatlov Pass incident, though any mention of the orchard was excised from the surviving records. Families were told their children had wandered into a blizzard. Yet one mother claimed she received a letter smuggled from a sympathetic officer, warning her to never speak of the black forest that grows without roots. As the years went on, the orchard sightings shifted further east, deeper into the Siberian expanse. A patrol near Yakutsk reported an orchard that flickered in and out of visibility, trees vanishing one by one until the entire grove winked out like extinguished stars. Another report mentions livestock found clustered around a ring of ash, eyes glassy, bodies rigid, as though they had frozen mid-breath. The herders spoke of a hum so low it made their bones ache, and of hearing voices, familiar ones, calling their names from between the trunks. The orchard was no longer just an environmental anomaly. It was seeping into the psychology of those who encountered it. Psychiatrists in Novosibirsk examined witnesses who described obsessive dreams, forests of glass, black fruits dripping molten sap, roots burrowing not into soil but into flesh. Many suffered nosebleeds, insomnia, disorientation. One soldier reportedly tore out his own tongue, scrawling in blood across the wall of his barracks, "It listens." His file was marked inconclusive and sealed. Still, the orchard left no stable evidence. By the time investigative teams arrived, it had always vanished. Only circles in the snow, the taste of iron in the air, the lingering failure of electrical equipment. Some scientists began to argue that it was an atmospheric mirage triggered by geomagnetic events. Others suggested it was mass hysteria, but a smaller, quieter faction proposed something more dangerous, that the orchard was Whispers linked it to laboratories in the Urals, where the Kurchatov Institute supposedly experimented with high-frequency resonance and geological manipulation. If such experiments could fracture stone, could they also fracture time, producing something that grew and died in hours? Was the orchard a side effect of Cold War ambition, an accident of physics never meant to touch the open air? In Moscow, silence hardened into denial. The Obsidian orchard does not exist, one Politburo note bluntly states, but the more it was denied, the more it returned, always at night, always unannounced, as if mocking the very notion of control. And for those who had seen it, black branches arching against a starless sky, denial meant nothing. They knew what they had walked past. They knew what had listened in the snow. By the early 1970s, across Siberia, scattered in whispers from Novosibirsk to Chita, were the same phrases. The trees that rise without roots, the hum that makes the bones ache, the ring of scorched snow where nothing grows afterward. Entire villages lived with the unspoken rule that one never traveled alone at night during winter, not because of wolves, not because of the cold, but because of the orchard. Children were told that if they heard branches crack where no forest stood, they must close their eyes until dawn, never to look. Such instructions became as ingrained as prayers, a quiet catechism of survival. Within the state archives, meanwhile, the orchard had become the subject of increasingly bizarre studies, hidden under the guise of seismic monitoring or industrial ecology. One surviving fragment of a classified 1971 report describes thermal signatures inconsistent with any known combustion process, radius 140 meters, concentric heat distribution with non-random fractal perimeter. Attached diagrams resemble neither geological maps nor botanical sketches, but something closer to blueprints, as if the orchard were not trees at all, but a kind of machinery assembled from trunks and branches. The language betrays both fascination and fear. A handwritten annotation in the margin reads, "Do not stand inside the ring, not even for measurement." One testimony from that period survives in the archives of Khabarovsk, later smuggled out in the 1990s by a defector. It came from a radio operator assigned to a Siberian air defense. He reported receiving interference patterns during a night watch that translated, when filtered through his equipment, into something like voices. Not Russian, not language, his transcript states, but cadence of speech, rising and falling like dialogue. The interference stopped the moment the orchard vanished at dawn. His superior dismissed it as static, caused by ionospheric anomalies, but the operator swore under oath that he had listened to a conversation between trees. The transcript ends with his reassignment to an unspecified facility in the Urals. He was never heard from again. In 1973, a disaster at a mining complex near Magadan was attributed to a sudden collapse of permafrost. Officially, the deaths of 32 miners were blamed on geological instability. Unofficially, local survivors told of a black forest sprouting across the slope above the mine entrance the night before. The miners joked nervously about it during supper, some even carving branches into the snow with their knives as if to mock the apparition. By morning, the orchard had withered, and within hours the shaft collapsed, burying them alive. The bodies recovered later were described in one suppressed report as unusually brittle, with tissue breakdown resembling advanced frostburn. But the temperature had never dropped below -10. Families received compensation, but only on the condition of signing documents forbidding them to speak of abnormal meteorological events. The orchard did not respect boundaries of secrecy. In 1975, tourists from Poland visiting Lake Baikal claimed they saw a black bloom on the ice late at night. They photographed it, but their cameras produced only blank negatives. Still, the story spread quietly across Eastern Europe through the underground press. A Czech samizdat publication later printed a sketch of the orchard under the title The Black Orchard of Siberia. For the first time, the phenomenon breached the Iron Curtain, if only as rumor. But within the USSR, more chilling accounts accumulated. A physician stationed in Yakutsk wrote that patients exposed to the orchard displayed involuntary memory regressions. One man began reciting childhood rhymes long forgotten, another spoke in the voice of his deceased brother. In a sealed testimony, a woman insisted that the orchard showed her visions of faces pressed against glass, lips moving silently. When she reached out to touch one, her hand blistered as though from steam. The physician himself was later arrested for disseminating anti-scientific superstition. His notes survive only as fragments copied by a sympathetic colleague, written in tiny script on the inside covers of a Soviet anatomy textbook. Not all encounters ended with survival. In December 1976, a military unit assigned to guard an industrial railway near Kansk vanished. Their encampment remained, weapons stacked neatly, rations unopened. The snow showed prints leading toward the forest, but at the end of the tracks lay only a circle of scorched ground. No bodies were ever recovered. An internal report classified the case as desertion. Yet the commander of the unit, found weeks later in a hospital in Krasnoyarsk, had a different story. He was discovered wandering alone on the frozen Yenisei, incoherent and frostbitten. When interrogated, he repeated a single phrase: the tree. His medical report, stamped classified, noted tissue collapse resembling irradiation. The deeper one digs, the more the orchard seems to blur the line between natural disaster and deliberate construction. Scientists who examined soil samples found silica fused with iron in lattices resembling man-made alloys. One metallurgist, quoted in a surviving note, compared the residue to slag from a foundry, but too precise, too symmetrical. Another suggested that the orchard was not growing but assembling, each trunk and branch part of a structure with a purpose we could not perceive. That notion, dangerous as it was, circulated quietly in Akademgorodok, among physicists who studied wave resonance. They spoke of standing forests, the way others spoke of standing waves, structures that appeared when energy aligned across If the orchard was such a structure, it was not merely a vision or a hallucination, it was the materialization of something operating at a scale beyond human comprehension. By the close of the decade, those who had seen the orchard firsthand rarely spoke of it, except in half-mad whispers. Yet every new report, whether from miners, soldiers, or herders, repeated the same final detail. When the orchard withered, it left behind silence. Not the silence of snow or wind, but a suffocating absence, as if sound itself had been drained away. In that silence, some claimed they felt watched. Others claimed they heard their own names carried in the ringing of their skulls. The orchard was no longer just an anomaly, it had become a presence, something that appeared, withdrew, and yet left a residue of terror, like fingerprints on the official communiques referred to frozen methane blooms, mirages of inversion layers, hallucinations triggered by fatigue. But in the sealed drawers of the NKVD and later the KGB, the orchard had another label, written in stark Cyrillic letters, Cherny Sad, Obsidian Orchard. The files grew thick with contradictions, maps with erased coordinates, testimonies scrawled in margins before being blacked out. Something was growing in the cracks of Soviet silence, something blacker than the trees themselves, the awareness that no denial could make them vanish. For those who lived near the taiga, there was only one certainty. Come winter, the orchard would bloom again. And every year, the question deepened like the frost in the earth. Was it a haunting of the past, or a signal of something that had yet to come? By the beginning of the 1980s, the orchard had slipped fully into the lexicon of the forbidden. It was not printed, not broadcast, not admitted even in whispers within official academies. And yet its shadow clung to the Soviet Union like smoke clings to walls long after a fire has passed. Beneath the surface of sanctioned research and industrial progress, another layer of files and experiments persisted, each one circling the same phenomenon like moths around a dark flame. What was the orchard? A weapon, a natural anomaly, a hallucination given form by trauma? The answers shifted with each report, but the orchard itself remained constant, growing and dying overnight, as if defying the very notion of explanation. In 1981, a group of electrical engineers working on the Baikal-Amur mainline railway project reported seeing the orchard emerge on the far side of a ravine. Their account, later extracted under duress, describes the forest blooming silently, branches unfolding in precise arcs, as if following mathematical. They sketched diagrams in their notebooks that bore eerie resemblance to antenna arrays or radio towers, the trunks forming grid-like alignments. The engineers claimed that as the orchard rose, their radio equipment filled with an unbroken tone that made their teeth ache. Hours later, when the trees collapsed into ash, the tone ceased instantly, and their instruments returned to normal. Their testimony was declared delirium-induced by fatigue, yet the confiscated sketches bear stamps of multiple ministries, as though they were passed hand to hand through channels that did not want to admit their curiosity. In the same year, a classified note from Leningrad details the hospitalization of 3 geologists who had camped overnight near Norilsk. They described awakening to find the orchard towering silently above them, its leaves black and reflective like shards of obsidian. One of them tried to touch a trunk and claimed it felt colder than ice, but left a burn-like welt across his palm. The second geologist insisted he saw lights pulsing within the branches like stars glimpsed through glass. The third was found days later wandering barefoot through the snow, incoherent, repeating the same sentence. We dug too deep and it answered. Their official cause of illness was listed as chemical exposure. Rumors linked the orchard to secret weapons testing. The Soviets, engaged in their desperate technological race with the West, were known to have experimented with unconventional energy systems. Whispers in scientific circles suggested that the orchard was the result of a resonance project, the attempt to harness natural frequencies of the Earth to generate power or communication. If so, The orchard was not a forest at all, but the visible side effect of invisible fields, nature itself bending under strains it was not meant to endure. But if this were true, then why did it appear in places far from any laboratory or facility, rising from abandoned gulag grounds, derelict mines, and forgotten stretches of taiga? Unless those very sites had been the testing grounds. The testimonies continued to accumulate, often smuggled out as folklore. In Kolyma, miners told of a night when the orchard rose across the river, its trees perfectly mirrored in the ice, and of men who swore they saw figures walking between the trunks. The figures did not look like soldiers or prisoners, but like silhouettes of themselves, shadows reenacting gestures, lifting invisible tools, whispering without sound. In Yakutia, herders spoke of black fruit hanging from branches, fruit that dripped molten sap onto the snow. When morning came, only pits remained, perfectly round depressions in the ice. Dogs refused to approach the sites. A particularly chilling case emerged in 1983 from a gulag site long since decommissioned. A construction team tasked with dismantling the barracks reported that at night an orchard appeared where the camp fence once stood. They saw prisoners, or what looked like prisoners, pacing the perimeter. Tattered uniforms, hollow faces, hands clutching at the branches as though begging for release. The workers fled. The next morning, nothing remained, but the wooden barracks were found splintered as if by immense pressure. The official report blamed frost damage. Yet one worker's diary, later discovered in a Moscow flea market, ends with a scrawled note. "It grows where they suffered. The trees drink the years we buried." By the mid-1980s, the KGB began a campaign not to study the orchard, but to erase it. Witnesses were detained, reports destroyed, fragments of evidence bled out in strange places. A photograph tucked inside a smuggled Bible, showing black silhouettes against a starry sky. A reel of film with the orchard faintly visible, burned at the edges as though the celluloid itself rejected the image. A soldier's letter home describing how his entire platoon stood transfixed before a forest without roots until dawn dispersed it. He never wrote again. His mother received only a box of belongings and a death certificate marked "Complications from Exposure." Still, within secret scientific circles, a few dared to theorize. One physicist proposed that the orchard was a standing wave of reality itself, a moment when the laws of time and matter aligned to create an echo of another world. Another argued it was a scar, a wound where history bled into the present, the labor camps, the buried dead, the silence of the taiga manifesting as physical form. The most radical claimed the orchard was not ours at all, but an intrusion, something projected into Siberia by forces beyond Earth, blooming like a beacon for reasons no human could yet understand. Whatever the truth, the orchard's appearances grew bolder in the twilight years of the Soviet Union. Reports surfaced not only from Siberia, but from the Urals, from forgotten stretches of Karelia, even near military installations on the Kazakh steppe. Always at night, always gone by dawn, always leaving silence and fear in its wake. The state grew weaker, its control slipping, and the orchard slipped through with it, no longer just a rumor in the taiga, but a story whispered in Moscow kitchens, in Leningrad apartments, in the cramped trains of men returning from distant postings. And then came 1986. In the shadow of Chernobyl's fire, when radiation plumes drifted across half of Europe, new whispers began that in the exclusion zone, amid the poisoned pines and skeletal birch, black trees had bloomed for a single night. No one could prove it. No photographs exist. But the rumor spread with radioactive dust, carried from one survivor to another. They said the orchard had risen out of the poisoned soil, and that for a few hours it had listened. Whether it was born of radiation, or whether the catastrophe itself had summoned it, no one knew. Only that those who claimed to see it described the same silence, the same glistening black leaves, the same hum that shook their bones. By the time the Soviet Union staggered toward collapse, the orchard had become an unspeakable metaphor. For some, for still others, it was something older, deeper, not Soviet at all, but Siberian, feeding on centuries of violence and secrecy. No explanation was safe, but all carried the same chill. The orchard bloomed without permission, and it could never be contained. And so the files thickened in drawers that no one wanted to open, stamped with denials that no one believed. The orchard had become what the system itself had become, something vast, silent, and rotting, standing for a single night before withering at dawn. Yet unlike the system, the orchard always returned. In the chaos of the late 1980s, as the Soviet Union began to fracture under the weight of its own contradictions, the orchard re-emerged like a wound that refused to heal, the mechanisms of secrecy. Among these fragments surfaced the most disturbing accounts yet, woven through collapsing institutions and the exhaustion of a state too distracted to erase every trace. In 1987, a brigade of young conscripts posted near Bratsk was sent to investigate what locals called the Night of Black Trees. The soldiers' own accounts, smuggled later through handwritten notes, describe entering a clearing where the orchard had risen. They claimed the trunks stood in unnaturally precise rows, equidistant as if measured, and the ground hummed beneath their boots. One soldier wrote that the trees did not cast shadows even under moonlight. That light seemed to bend away from them. Another noted that when he tried to mark one trunk with his knife, the blade dulled instantly, its edge crumbling like chalk. At dawn, when the orchard vanished, 2 soldiers were missing. Their rifles lay neatly stacked on the snow, but no footprints led away from the site. Officially, the report lists them as deserters. The following winter brought another event, this time near an abandoned gulag outside Vorkuta. Villagers claimed that at midnight, a black orchard erupted from the permafrost, its canopy spreading in silence. A small group approached, carrying lanterns. They later swore they saw the silhouettes of prisoners walking between the trunks, bent double under invisible burdens. One woman insisted she recognized her father, who had disappeared in the camps decades earlier. She claimed he looked at her, mouth moving soundlessly, before vanishing into the leaves. When morning came, she was found kneeling in the circle of ash, incoherent, her hair streaked white. Her family was told she had suffered a nervous collapse. She never spoke again. Across Siberia, testimonies accumulated like snowdrifts. A train engineer described seeing the orchard flare into existence beside the tracks, glowing faintly with an inner light, his instruments flickering with static until dawn. Fishermen on the Yenisei reported that black leaves floated briefly on the water before dissolving into nothing. In Chita, a meteorological station recorded an unexplainable spike in electromagnetic activity during a night when locals swore they saw a black forest on the horizon. The data was confiscated. The station's director later told a colleague in a hushed voice that the pattern resembled not random interference, but a signal. Rumors within the crumbling Soviet military linked the orchard to long-abandoned experimental projects. One persistent theory held that it was a byproduct of seismic resonance testing, efforts to weaponize the frequencies of the Earth itself. If such experiments had ever been conducted, their results were buried under mountains of secrecy. But defectors later recalled that certain files labeled Cherny Sad had been kept under the same classification tier as nuclear weapons research. The orchard was not an anomaly, they insisted. It was an accident, one that could never be repeated safely. But another set of documents, scattered through scientific institutes in Novosibirsk and Moscow, hinted at a different possibility. The orchard was not the result of Soviet experiments, but the reason for them. Reports suggest that its appearances had been noted as early as the 1920s, long before the atomic age, in the forgotten diaries of gulag guards and railway builders. Stalin's regime, desperate to turn anomalies into weapons, had seized on the orchard as something that might be harnessed. Laboratories in the Urals were tasked with replicating its effects. If a forest could grow overnight and vanish by dawn, what else might be forced to appear and disappear? Bridges, weapons, entire cities. The orchard was not created by Soviet science. It was pursued by it. Like a journalist in Irkutsk published a short article about phantom forests in the taiga, drawing on the whispers of hunters and villagers. The piece was quickly suppressed, but not before samizdat presses copied it. Across Moscow, copies circulated in smoky kitchens, each retelling darker than the last. One version claimed the orchard was an alien structure, blooming to transmit signals into the cosmos. Another insisted it was a scar left by Soviet crimes, nature itself remembering the suffering buried in the permafrost. Still another called it a doorway, one that opened for a single night to somewhere human beings were never meant to enter. In 1989, with the Union collapsing into chaos, the orchard appeared again near Yakutsk. This time it was not peasants or soldiers who saw it, but a delegation of geologists working under state contract. Their official report has never been found, but scattered pages leaked years later tell a chilling story. The geologists describe standing within the grove, instruments recording impossible readings, temperatures fluctuating wildly, compasses reversing polarity, watches stopping altogether. One man claimed he heard his own voice calling from somewhere deeper in the orchard. Another swore he saw an orchard of white trees overlaid atop the black, flickering like a double exposure. When dawn came, 2 members of the team were gone. Their tents remained, their equipment untouched, but their journals contained frantic scribbles. It's not here for us, it's here for itself. As the Soviet Union disintegrated in 1991, the orchard seemed to dissolve with it. Official attention shifted elsewhere, to revolutions, economic collapse, the crumbling of borders. But in villages across Siberia, in Moscow, a handful of researchers tried to preserve the scattered files before they could be destroyed. One of them, writing anonymously in a samizdat pamphlet, left a final note that would outlive the empire. The Obsidian orchard is not a story. It is not an illusion. It blooms where silence is deepest, where memory cannot be buried. We do not study it, we are studied by it. And when it comes again, it will not vanish at dawn. Thus, the orchard entered the post-Soviet era, like a relic pulled from a forgotten drawer, erased on paper, denied by officials, and yet alive in the minds of those who had stood before its black trees. A phenomenon too vast to ignore, too dangerous to name, too strange to contain. It waited in the snow, in the silence of Siberia, in the unfinished sentences of files marked destroyed. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, the orchard did not disappear from memory. If anything, it resurfaced more strongly, carried into the new world by those who were suddenly free to speak. In the early 1990s, as archives were ransacked and files sold on the black market, fragments of Cherny-Sad dossiers began to circulate among journalists and collectors of forbidden history. Most were scraps, half-burned pages, photocopies of field sketches, transcripts with whole paragraphs blacked out. Yet even these were enough to reignite the myth. It became a symbol of the uncertainty of the new Russia, the hidden orchard that no one could map, the secret that even the empire could not kill. Local stories, freed from decades of suppression, began pouring out. A fisherman in Irkutsk claimed he had seen the orchard rise again in the winter of 1992, reflected in the frozen surface of Lake. He swore the trees looked hollow, like glass tubes filled with moving shapes, though no one else on his boat dared to confirm it. In Yakutsk, miners told of black leaves drifting down onto their camp, melting into the snow before they could be touched. And in Magadan, an old woman recounted how as a child she saw her father, taken away by NKVD guards in the 1930s, walking silently among the trunks of an orchard, that appeared outside her village. She wept as she told the story, saying, "He was not looking at me, he was looking through me." By this time, post-Soviet Russia had little interest in silencing such accounts. The machinery of censorship was broken, but indifference was a different kind of silence. Officials dismissed these testimonies as folklore, as the superstitions of a country drowning in poverty and collapse. Still, a few independent researchers took note. A professor of geophysics in Novosibirsk, the points formed a strange lattice across Siberia, echoing the paths of old Gulag railways. He presented his findings at a minor conference, only to be laughed at. Months later, he vanished, his apartment ransacked, his notes gone. Meanwhile, in the chaos of privatization, a darker rumor spread. Former military officers whispered that fragments of orchard soil had been smuggled west, sold to private laboratories. One story claimed that an American research institute briefly possessed a sample before sealing it in a vault, declaring it unstable. Another said that in Germany, a group of scientists exposed to orchard fragments suffered the same hallucinations described in Soviet files, voices calling their names, dreams of forests made of glass. These rumors were never confirmed, but they added a new layer to the mystery. Perhaps they said the orchard still bloomed where it always had, in the frozen wastes, in the abandoned camps, in the empty valleys where no one lived anymore. Hunters still came back with stories of hearing a low hum at night. Travelers along the Trans-Siberian line swore they glimpsed black silhouettes in the distance vanishing by dawn. A few even tried to profit from it, selling tours into supposed orchard sites. None of those expeditions ever found evidence beyond circles of dead earth and trees split by frost. Yet one group of students from Moscow claimed they filmed something, hours of snowy darkness, punctuated by shapes that flickered like standing shadows. The footage was never released. Their university advisor died in a car accident weeks later. By the late 1990s, the orchard had become something else, a modern myth wrapped around a secret no one could prove. Writers turned it into stories, filmmakers whispered about projects that never saw release, and in dimly lit apartments, conspiracy theorists linked it to everything from Chernobyl to the fall of the Soviet Union itself. But beneath the stories lay a truth that remained unchanged. People continued to vanish in Siberia. Hikers, hunters, entire convoys swallowed by winter. And when locals spoke of these disappearances, they did not mention wolves or snowstorms. They spoke of the orchard. For the first time, the orchard was no longer a purely Soviet phenomenon. It had slipped into the global imagination, carried by defectors, by rumors, by fragments of files that should have been destroyed. Yet its essence remained the same as it had always been. A black forest that grew overnight and withered by dawn, leaving only silence in its wake. And for those who had stood before it, silence was the most terrifying thing of all. In the early 2000s, the orchard returned to the headlines, not in official press, but in whispers carried across the newly opened internet. On obscure forums, travelers and truckers began posting about strange lights in the taiga, sudden dead zones where GPS failed, and circles of scorched snow discovered by oil surveyors. Some of these stories were dismissed as hoaxes, but others carried a resonance too close to the old Soviet accounts to ignore. An anonymous post from 2003 described a convoy of supply trucks bound for Yakutia that halted when trees appeared across the road where there had been none. The drivers swore the forest was perfectly symmetrical, stretching for kilometers, yet every branch seemed made of stone. One driver claimed his radio picked up a transmission of voices, speaking Russian with outdated vocabulary, as if from another decade. By dawn, the orchard had vanished. Journalists tried to chase these leads, But the new Russian state was no less skilled at burying inconvenient mysteries than the old one. Official agencies denied everything, attributing the reports to fatigue, faulty equipment, or drunken exaggeration. Yet quietly, government-funded expeditions continued. Oil companies reported environmental anomalies in regions near former Gulag sites. One leaked memo from a Moscow energy firm warned investors of zones of unexplainable equipment failure. In private correspondence, engineers described drilling rigs shutting down overnight, their electronics fused as though struck by lightning. One letter ends bluntly, "It's the orchard. They didn't tell us it was still out here." At the same time, villagers in remote Siberian regions began to notice a new pattern. The orchard no longer bloomed only in deep wilderness. It began to appear near settlements, sometimes within sight of houses. In 2006, a hunter near Irkutsk claimed the orchard rose at the edge of his village, its leaves glistening with frost. When he approached, he said the trees reflected not his own face, but the face of his brother who had died years before in Afghanistan. He collapsed in the snow, foaming at the mouth. He survived, but never spoke again. His neighbors insisted the orchard had fed on him, taking something invisible but vital. The new Russia, with its fascination for spectacle and conspiracy, began weaving the orchard into popular lore. Documentaries on late-night television hinted at phantom forests in Siberia, blurring fact and fiction with reenactments. Paranormal researchers flocked to the region, though few returned with evidence beyond shaky footage of snow and shadows. Some insisted the orchard was a natural electromagnetic phenomenon, tied to fault lines and permafrost collapse. Others claimed it was the residue of Soviet experiments finally breaking free, ghosts of science that refused to stay buried. A minority believed it was not Soviet at all, but something cosmic, a signal or visitation manifesting through the Earth itself. But for those who lived closest, explanations mattered little. In villages near the Lena River, old women kept traditions alive, covering mirrors at night during winter, placing iron nails at thresholds to ward off the orchard's hum. They swore that those who ignored these rituals disappeared. A story circulated of a group of teenagers who mocked the warnings, walking out into the snow with cameras. They never returned. Their phones were found in a circle of ash, each one recording only silence. Hours of silence, broken by faint, rhythmic cracks, like branches shifting in the wind. Meanwhile, scientists who dared investigate, a climatologist in Novosibirsk, who published a paper on localized electromagnetic forests, lost her position within weeks. A Moscow physicist who compared orchard sightings to satellite interference was found dead in his apartment, his notes burned in the stove. By the mid-2010s, the orchard was once again buried under official denial, spoken of only in whispers and obscure online communities. Yet the reports continued. Drivers saw it. Hunters swore they heard it. Satellite images showed patches of forest that vanished between passes. And so the orchard lingered in the new century as it had in the old. Not a story to be explained, but a silence that explained itself. A phenomenon that appeared, withered, and left behind questions no regime could answer. The Soviet Union had collapsed, but the orchard had not. It continued to bloom in the darkness of Siberia, as if indifferent to borders, government. By the late 2010s, the orchard had become a kind of secret inheritance, passed down through generations of Siberians who knew never to write its name. In Moscow, it was forgotten, buried beneath wars, politics, and spectacle. But in the villages and mining camps, people still looked toward the horizon on certain winter nights, dreading the silence that preceded its blooming. Younger voices mocked the old tales, yet even they fell quiet when GPS units froze, or when radios filled with static that carried the faint cadence of speech. In 2017, a group of documentary filmmakers from St. Petersburg traveled east in hopes of capturing the orchard on film. They interviewed hunters, former prisoners, and oil workers. Their recordings are strange. One old man insists the orchard grew directly over the ruins of a gulag camp, and that each tree rose exactly where a prisoner had fallen. Another swears he saw the orchard shift shape, the trunks bending into arches like doorways. The filmmakers vanished in Yakutia. Weeks later, their car was found on a snow-covered road, doors open, cameras inside. The footage ends with the sound of a rising hum, the frame black except for faint reflections, like glass leaves in darkness. At the same time, whispers spread of new military involvement. Satellite contractors reported anomalies in Siberian images, patches of darkness, circles of disrupted snow, zones where data corrupted without cause. One insider claimed that the orchard was deliberately censored from public satellite feeds, but that private satellites caught glimpses, forests that appeared and disappeared between passes, leaving only geometric scars on the land. None of these images ever surfaced, but the rumor alone was enough to fuel a new wave of speculation. Among locals, the orchard began to take on a new role, not just as an omen of death, but as something like a bound. People said it marked places where the living should not tread, where the weight of memory pressed too heavily on the earth. They described hearing voices from the trunks, sometimes loved ones, sometimes strangers, always speaking without sound. A hunter near Krasnoyarsk confessed that he entered one such grove and saw his mother, dead for 30 years, seated at the base of a tree. When he tried to embrace her, he awoke outside the circle at dawn, frostbitten and alone. He never hunted again. Scholars who studied post-Soviet folklore noted how the orchard absorbed the traumas of history. It was no longer just a Cold War anomaly, but a vessel for everything buried in the taiga, the gulags, the vanished convoys, the mines where men froze at their work. The orchard was Siberia, remembering itself. Yet others warned that this explanation was too comfortable. It was not memory, they argued, a manifestation of something that could not be explained by Soviet crimes or folklore alone. As technology advanced, a few dared to probe deeper. In 2019, a team of researchers equipped with drones and spectrographic cameras ventured toward a suspected site near Magadan. Their instruments recorded an unexplainable spike in radiation and magnetism just after midnight, followed by a sudden blackout of all devices. When the data was recovered, it showed a field of heat signatures shaped like trees, dozens of them, appearing where the drone footage showed only snow. The team leader wrote in his log, "The orchard was there, but it refused the camera." He died months later in an unexplained accident. His colleagues refused to speak publicly. By now, the orchard had escaped Soviet secrecy, post-Soviet neglect, and the gaze of satellites. It persisted as it always had. The world around it changed, empires collapsed, governments rose and fell, but the orchard endured. And in its endurance, it grew more terrifying because it suggested that it had never belonged to history at all. It was not a Soviet story, not even a Russian one. It was older, patient, indifferent to time. Those who had seen it knew this truth, though they rarely dared to say it aloud. The orchard was waiting. For what? No one could say. But each winter, when the snow lay heavy and the nights stretched endless, a question stirred among those who still remembered the hum in their bones. What will happen when... By the 2020s, the Obsidian orchard had become a specter moving through every layer of memory. A Cold War anomaly, a Soviet experiment, a folkloric curse, a cosmic intrusion. Each attempt to define it failed, collapsing like its trees at dawn. Yet the deeper one looks, the more it seems the orchard was not an isolated phenomenon at all, but part of something larger, an invisible architecture stretching across Siberia and perhaps beyond, marked only by its fleeting appearance and absolute silence. Independent researchers who tried to piece together the scattered reports began to notice unsettling patterns. The orchard almost always bloomed near places of erasure. Gulags where records had been destroyed, mining towns abandoned after disasters, villages erased from maps. Each site was bound by the same ritual: growth without roots, withering by dawn, silence left behind. Some argued this was coincidence, a simple mapping of trauma across the land. Others saw design. One mathematician in Tomsk traced the coordinates of documented orchard sites and found that, when connected, they formed geometric lattices, intersecting lines across thousands of kilometers. He likened it to a circuit diagram, a machine spread across Siberia with trees as its visible wiring. Weeks later, he vanished on a trip to the Ural foothills. His last email to a colleague contained only 3 words: "It's not ours." As the orchard seeped into global rumor, governments began to watch more closely. Satellite contractors noticed recurring anomalies over Saka, brief flashes of black shapes, shadows appearing where no forest had ever grown. In 2021, a declassified NATO intelligence brief referenced phantom vegetation structures in Russia's interior, speculating they might be linked to secret radar installations. But the tone of the report betrayed unease. Structures appear and disappear within hours. No logistical support detected. Not attributable to human engineering. In the margin of one page, a handwritten note reads simply, "Soviets never controlled it." Meanwhile, civilian witnesses continued to emerge. In 2022, a pair of hikers posted footage online showing a line of dark trunks in the distance. The video is grainy, the figures barely discernible against the snow, but the audio is chilling, the hikers laughing nervously before their voices fade, replaced by a low-frequency hum that rattles the microphone. The clip ends abruptly. Days later, both hikers disappeared. Authorities claimed they were lost in a blizzard, but those who watched the video swore the trees were moving, not swaying with the wind, but shifting position like figures in a procession. The footage was scrubbed from major platforms within weeks. At the same time, in the villages closest to the taiga, the orchard remained as present as it had been half a century earlier. Old women swore they still saw black leaves drifting across the snow. Hunters spoke of hearing voices, sometimes their own, sometimes others, calling from between the trunks. Children played a game in which they dared one another to step into the silent circle at night. One boy never returned. His parents buried an empty coffin, but neighbors whispered that he had been taken by the orchard. They said it grows strongest when the living fail to remember the dead. And still, the question of origin gnawed at those who dared study it. Was the orchard born of Soviet ambition? A residue of forgotten experiments? A scar left by gulags, where the ground itself had memorized suffering? Or was it something alien, a signal passing briefly into the material world, assembling itself in shapes that resembled trees only because that was the closest our minds could comprehend? Theories piled upon theories, but the orchard itself gave no answers. It appeared. It withered. It left behind silence. In 2023, a team of geophysicists attempted the boldest experiment yet. They placed seismographs, magnetometers, and drones along a suspected orchard site near Yakutsk, hoping to catch it in bloom. For one night, their instruments recorded nothing but static. But at dawn, when the team returned to collect the data, they found the snow blackened in concentric rings. Every drone battery had melted into its casing. Their laptops displayed corrupted files filled with thousands of repetitions of a single Cyrillic word: Slushayet. It listens. By now, the orchard had become more than a phenomenon. It was a mirror, a reflection of the state that tried to erase it, of the land that birthed it, of the people who endured it. Each generation saw something different in its black leaves. Prisoners saw their suffering, scientists saw experiments, villagers saw curses, and soldiers saw fear. But beneath each interpretation lay the same fact: something emerged in the Siberian night that should not have existed, and no dawn could ever erase its memory completely. And so the story ends where it began, with silence. The orchard has not been explained, not mapped, not contained. It grows where it wishes, withers when it chooses, and leaves behind only a residue of dread. The Soviet Union tried to bury it, and failed. Post-Soviet Russia tried to ignore it, and failed. Foreign governments tried to dismiss it, and failed. All that remains is the orchard itself, blooming unseen in the deep winter nights, a black forest without roots. Perhaps it is nothing but legend, a story born from hunger and fear in the frozen gulags, amplified by paranoia and secrecy. Perhaps it is a fragment of something real, a scientific anomaly never properly understood. Or perhaps it is older still, a presence that has always been here, waiting for silence deep enough to bloom. And if one night the orchard refuses to wither at dawn, if its trees remain when the sun rises, then all the denials, all the erasures, all the broken empires will mean nothing. Because the orchard will no longer be hidden. It will stand where all can see it. And in that moment, the world will finally have to ask the question that every Soviet file, every whispered testimony, every silenced witness avoided. Did the Soviet Union really erase a whole city? Or did the orchard erase the Soviet Union?